Welcome back to the channel. I'm Lisa Taylor-Austin, licensed psychotherapist and expert witness. And today I have a very special guest who I'd like to welcome back to the channel. Dr. Anthony Mazzella is a psychoanalyst in New York City. And while his focus with his patients is psychodynamic in nature, his main goals are to build a trusting relationship and help each patient reduce the frequency and intensity of their emotional, painful thoughts and suffering. He specializes in working with narcissistic personality disorder and has developed a very informative podcast called the Narcissism Decoder, and we'll put the link to that in the description of this video. Welcome, Dr. Mazzella. It's so nice to have you back here again.
Hi, Lisa. Thank you for having me again. I'm really excited to be here with yet another fascinating topic.
Yes, you lend so much introspection and insight into this topic, and I know we all appreciate it very much. Today, we want to talk a little bit with you about vulnerable narcissism. So, what is vulnerable narcissism?
Okay, so I'm very curious to hear your definition as well, but let me kick it off, Lisa, and then feel free to jump in as always, okay? So
Yes.
here's my understanding of it in my own experience. This is what I see in my practice. So vulnerable narcissism is a subtype of narcissism marked by a profound emotional fragility and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Like many of the subtypes of narcissism, these individuals experience a fragile sense of self-esteem, hypersensitivity to criticism, and a desperate need for validation. However, this is the big however, the way they get this validation is quite unique. Unlike the grandiose narcissist, for instance, who projects superiority and confidence, the vulnerable narcissist appears as intensely needy and dependent on others. In other words, instead of being overtly grandiose,
Mhm.
they are overtly insecure and emotionally exposed, oscillating between feelings of inferiority and just fleeting moments of superiority, which you hear when you get closer to them. Now, they often present as fragile and sensitive individuals who require special attention and care. They may appear as interested in you, they may appear as modest and sometimes self-effacing, but underneath they harbor a deep-seated need for constant admiration and reassurance. It's very common to hear on popular social media that this is a mask of fragility and that it's like a manipulation, right? But if your
Yes.
goal is to repel them, right, or push them away, or get this kind of person out of your life, then I think it's very helpful to think of these behaviors as manipulative. But my goal in working with these individuals is always to get closer to them, to better understand, right? Therefore, I tend to think that they are in desperate need of empathy and support from others, but they just don't know how to genuinely communicate this need. They often feel unable to express their vulnerability in a healthy way. So they may engage in like avoidance strategies such as withdrawal, passive aggressive behaviors like becoming more clingy or sulking or needy or desperate. They may also escape into excessive fantasizing about success or idealized lives. This behavior aligns with what renowned psychoanalyst, this is Otto Kernberg, his name is, but he describes this as a parasitic life where these individuals are unable to establish a stable internal sense of self, and instead they rely heavily on external sources for validation and to feel whole. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. That's the way I see them present. But yeah, please jump in. I see that maybe you have some thoughts about this too, or you see it in a slightly different way.
No, that's a very comprehensive explanation. I think oftentimes vulnerable narcissists come across as being very humble, very sincere, and surprisingly, very empathetic.
Yes.
They can present as though they're very empathetic to you. And
Yes.
so vulnerable narcissists tend to be very difficult in our personal lives to
Yes.
pick up on the fact that they're a narcissist even at all.
Hmm.
Oftentimes, I think that a person has to know the vulnerable narcissist for years before they even recognize, I think this person might be a narcissist.
Hmm. Hmm. Yes. Yeah, they
Another,
try really hard. I mean, it's such an interesting point. I heard this just recently from a patient of mine, and you may have heard this too. It's like fake empathy, they call it. And it's interesting because you hear people have a strong reaction to that, like, oh, they're faking it. But on the other hand, again, this is in the service of getting closer to these people and understanding them. I mean, I kind of think like which one is more damaging? Faking empathy, which is like really trying, in other words, when you get close to these people and you hear them talk about this, they really want to feel like they want to cry. They come in sometimes and they say, look, I don't have a capacity to cry. Like, why can't I cry and feel empathy? That's a really good prognostic sign compared to the grandiose narcissist who doesn't really care if he has empathy or not, because in his mind, that's just a sign of weakness. Yeah.
right. So you really hear from your patients that these vulnerable narcissists kind of recognize that they're different from other people. And maybe there's some things they want to change, but they don't know how to go about doing it.
Yes.
I just thought of a question. Is
Hmm.
covert narcissism the same thing as vulnerable narcissism?
This is my own opinion on this, Lisa, but I would say it's on a continuum. Okay.
Hmm.
So in the social media, I often hear the words used interchangeably, and that is because there is some overlap between the two subtypes of narcissism. But one of the main distinguishing characteristics, at least in my mind, and I'd love to hear your opinion on this too, is when I work with covert narcissists, the main difference is you hear a lot more of the guilt inducing comments. Like you end up feeling when you're with them, you feel guilty. You're made to feel bad that you're not doing more for them or that you've done something wrong, that you ruined my life. That's something that I've heard, right? You've ruined my life. And then you start to feel guilty. Whereas with the vulnerable narcissist, predominantly what I hear more of is, I'm such a loser, or I'm so pathetic. I can't do this on my own. I don't know how. Please help me. And that's a big difference when you're working and trying to get close to these people.
That's a really good description. I find that vulnerable narcissists oftentimes present very depressed. There's
Yes.
this sullen, kind of an Eeyore, from Winnie the Pooh. This
Mm,
sullen, woe is me, poor me, why can't things just be better?
yes.
And they ignite a caretaking quality in the other person. So the other person that they're talking to starts to feel like they need to or they want to take care of them. And
Yes.
and this happens obviously much more in interpersonal relationships like dating or a marriage or a partnership. um, I don't know so much about like work relationships. I would think that they trigger that same caretaking quality even in those
Mm,
situations as well.
yeah. I'm not an expert on the work situation. It's something I've been thinking about getting more involved in, but I can't say for sure what happens at work, but I imagine it's more they call their colleague and they start complaining about management and they try to recruit a colleague to join in in their suffering. That's what I could imagine.
Yes, yes. So how does vulnerable narcissism kind of manifest or present itself in interpersonal relationships?
Okay,
We
yeah,
we just talked a little about
yeah,
it. If you have
yeah,
anything more
we're
you
kind
want
of
to
there
add?
already, but let's go into it because as you can imagine, and I think that's what we're saying, it could be very challenging, in part because of, as I mentioned a moment ago, they have these intense needs, but they don't know how to genuinely communicate them. And that's a key piece of it that I want to keep going back to it. So vulnerable narcissists often seek out individuals who can provide, like you were just describing. So they need this constant validation, and this is what they crave. And they rely on this constant reassurance, emotional, and at times even financial support. Like picture somebody going home, or turning to their parents, an adult, you know, can you help take out another can you take out a second mortgage on your home to help me buy my home? Something like that. So,
That's very interesting because I hear from a lot of partners that narcissists of all types of narcissists really manipulate through financial avenues.
yes,
And I'm wondering, that's a little bit of that. I mean, they're vulnerable, so they're wanting help, but isn't it a form of manipulation too?
let's hold on to that word manipulation because I
Okay.
want to, for your listeners, I want to open that up and take a little bit of the stereotype out of it. And we'll do that as we go along. But I just want to remind you, you did that a little bit already because you said they're craving, they're looking for something, they're looking for someone to take care of them. Now we have to imagine if they're looking for someone to take care of them, I'm getting a little ahead of ourselves, but the question then is, why are they looking for that? What do they actually need? And then can we really call it a form of manipulation when they're just trying to survive? Because we all have, if we all had something that was really missing in our life and we're like walking around with a big hole, of course we're going to try whatever's necessary to get that hole filled. So that's a little different than saying manipulation, but I promise you we'll go into that and I want to open it up a little bit more. But
Yes, that's very
yeah,
different than manipulation, and I'm glad that you point that out
yeah,
because I think what happens is for people on the receiving end of the narcissist behavior, comments, personality, it just feels like conscious manipulation
yes,
when
exactly.
sometimes maybe it is, but a lot of times it's not.
Yeah. And we're going to get into that too, because I want to do a deep dive with you, Lisa, in terms of how do you relate to somebody like this in your life without feeling like you're being intentionally manipulated by them. But
That
let's
would
hold
be
off on that. Let's continue to lay the foundation, okay? And,
absolutely.
but I mean, we're so close to it because you're asking, how do they do? Like, what goes on in interpersonal relationships, right? And this is something I've been thinking about a lot. And in a recent podcast that I actually released, I spoke about something called helplessness. And helplessness is so close to what we're describing. So in that episode, I explored and then I explained why there's a constant need for this reassurance and support. And actually, this brings up an important question, right? And this is what you and I were just getting into, Lisa, is what is at the heart of helplessness? What is it, in other words, that the vulnerable narcissists are truly seeking? Why is this important? Because if we could keep in mind, or at least have in mind, some sort of theory of why they're doing this or why they're being what you call manipulative, in my own opinion, it helps sort of cool us down a little bit because we could say, oh, I understand what's going on now when they do this. And it's not just about them manipulating me. So let me just take a moment, if you don't mind. And
Sure.
I think you'll appreciate this because in listening to your content, I know that you do this as well, which is we need a theoretical framework in terms of why they are this way. And you have a theory, and I've heard you explain this before, and I want to go into it and sort of, integrate it, let's say, with what I'm thinking. So you have this theory that there's a movie, right? Because of some early childhood experience that they have like a movie that they replay in their mind. Am I getting that right? I'm just going based on our last interview and some of the content that I've heard.
Right. So we talked about them having this introject, which some have described as like a movie and they're interacting as if they're interacting with another movie character or like
Mm-hmm.
a bot or a hologram
Yes.
representation of another person in their mind.
Yes. Okay. Right. So let's get into this movie. Like, what is the actual script? Like, what's the plot of the movie and what's the script? So, this is one theory. Please, again, always jump in.
Mhm.
But at its core, the goal, we're talking about neediness. The goal of neediness is to find someone who could do what? Make them feel safe, a person that can hold space for their anxieties, respond with emotional attunement, and avoid meeting their desperation with anger, annoyance, frustration, even in the most challenging moments. So, in other words, what I'm suggesting is you consider that this is what they're looking for. They're looking for this type of person in their movie, this type of whatever we could call it, interpersonal relationship. When and why do they look for this person? When early expressions of need, whether through smiles, cries, or pleas, were met with indifference or annoyance or irritation, as a child, they learn to doubt their ability to draw this caring attention to their emotions. Instead of feeling like a caregiver could contain and soothe their distress, they were left to fend for themselves emotionally. The caregivers cannot be there in a way that they really needed them. Perhaps the adults were what? Too stressed, too depressed, too preoccupied. So when the help is repeatedly not available over time, one way the developing child adapts is by employing omnipotent and demanding strategies to get their needs met. And this lays the groundwork for a narcissistic type of relationship. Despite their desperate need for emotional attunement and understanding, these individuals often come to associate vulnerability with danger. So that's the underlying theory. So they can't really be vulnerable. Even though we're calling them vulnerable narcissists, they're not really vulnerable in a genuine way, if that makes sense. They're vulnerable in a demanding, like we said, the clinging, the desperation, the way they're so pathetic is to activate you to come in and to rescue them or to play a role of something in their life, like a caregiver that they never had. So let me put, yeah,
Absolutely.
please jump in there. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I agree with that 100%. They're trying to trigger in you the parental figure that they
Mm-hmm.
never had. And I think also, too, some of what you talked about sounds to me like this might be where their need for control comes in.
Mm-hmm.
Because if they never had their needs met, then they start to feel very insecure and they feel vulnerable as
Yeah.
young toddlers. And so they might want to feel more in control. And that can come across, even with a vulnerable narcissist, as them being controlling.
Yes. Yes. And they are controlling. So they are. There's no doubt. And that there's the overlap maybe with the word you used earlier, that they become manipulative, because that's controlling is a form of manipulation. So it's not to say that they don't do this, like they do this, but the way I'm trying to open it up is if we can understand the motive behind why they're doing it, again, hopefully that will cool us down. And instead of reacting in the the familiar way, which is what reenacts something from their childhood, where we get annoyed or we yell at them or we push back on them or we tell them, the typical American type, approach to this is what? Push through. What's it? Pull up your bootstraps or something? I forgot the exact.
Yes, pull
Yeah.
yourself up by your bootstraps.
Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Um, so, so they kind of really manage their emotional vulnerabilities differently than other people and
Yes.
differently than other types of narcissists.
Yes.
Mhm,
Yeah. So let's look at other people just to juxtapose this, and then
mhm.
this will, I think, give us a clearer sense. So let's say other people, non-vulnerable narcissists, right? When they perceive their emotional vulnerabilities, right? Like if they get overwhelmed, they don't feel that their vulnerability is intolerable like the narcissist does. So it's not, in other words, to be vulnerable is not that direct threat that I mentioned earlier. See, for the vulnerable narcissist to be genuinely vulnerable, it's a threat because of this early childhood experience. They know that they were met with what? Excessive frustration, or they were dismissed. But other people who don't have this personality problem or disorder, then they're okay. They're more comfortable with their own vulnerability. It's like they don't have this fragile sense of self because, again, they're not associating vulnerability with danger. So that's one of the main distinguishing sort of characteristics. So unlike others who might accept vulnerability as a natural part of the human experience, the vulnerable narcissists often shield themselves with defenses that make genuine vulnerability nearly impossible. In other words, so vulnerable narcissists often engage in what can be, it can be described as a literal mode of interaction. I'm just introducing a little bit of psychoanalytic jargon here, but I see this so frequently in my practice. Like these patients often share their experiences in a way that feels more like they're just venting, or where painful thoughts and feelings are like just dumped or purged. In other words, stories are often shared not to expand self awareness or foster closer relationships, but rather to convey immediate emotional pain. And then, as you and I were discussing, solicit validation that someone has hurt them, for instance. Does that, I don't know if that makes sense, but it's really that they function in what we call the literal mode. And the literal mode is like very concretely, I need you to do something for me and to do it immediately because, again, frustration tolerance is low because they've been overly frustrated their whole life.
Frustration tolerance is very low in
Hmm.
vulnerable narcissists. As you mentioned earlier, they have a tendency to get very anxious and impulsive. I need this
Yeah.
done right now. I have to do this right now. As soon as something comes in their mind, there's a tendency to be impulsive about it and just act on it. And they'll oftentimes try to get you to do that too.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the goal. That's the ultimate goal. And that's the way they get that recognition and validation. You see, you mentioned a couple minutes ago, non-vulnerable narcissists do it differently. Grandiose narcissists do it with their, their outward behavior, like everybody admired me. So they get their supplies and, the admiration. The vulnerable narcissist gets their supplies when you step in and you do it for them because now they're like, they feel so cared for. And you said it, Lisa, just a moment ago. You said, I need you to do it right now. But if you just put a period right after I need, and you cut out everything else in your mind as someone who's trying to be with somebody like this, then you could hear, I need. See, I have a need, but I can't really express it. I can't be vulnerable in that way. And that's our work then. If we're in a relationship with them, I say work because I'm always like with a therapeutic mindset, but that's the goal, is then to help them begin to see that they have a need and that that's okay to have a need. And we could talk about it because once you could talk about it, now it's not in that literal mode anymore. And that's what non-personality disordered people do. Remember, I said they're not so threatened. And if they're not so threatened, then what that means is they could talk about a need, they could use language, and that's what we call the representational mode of interaction. In other words, just talking about things is good enough. We don't need you to literally take care of it for me, if that makes sense.
It does. You know, Dr. Mazzella, thank you so much for giving a humanistic insight into this because obviously vulnerable narcissists are humans, but I
Yes.
think they're so frustrating to the partner, which is what we're talking about in this particular video with a partner. They're so frustrating to the partner, and the partner feels so invisible and manipulated that I think it's very difficult for the partner to recognize what you talked with us about today.
Yes.
So I thank you for joining us today and really shedding your expertise on this. I'd like to have you back so we can talk a little bit next time about the role shame plays in the vulnerable narcissist.
Yeah, that would be great. And just for your listeners, I want them to know that I'm going to have you next. Okay, Lisa? So you're coming over to my channel. So next, what I like to do with you is you and I can talk about, you were just saying how frustrating it is to be with somebody like this because there's this constant pull on you. So what we really need to do is help people, I think, at least in my opinion, again, not popular in social media, but in my opinion, for those people who are interested in being in some kind of relationship with somebody like this, who the goal is not just to leave, then the question becomes, how do we exist and feel like we exist in this type of relationship? And that's what we'll go into when you come on over to my podcast in our next episode, okay?
Yes, thanks for having me. And I'll put the link to part two
Oh,
in the
great.
description of this video. And I ask people to please comment on what you heard here today and please subscribe to the channel because it does help the channel. Thank you so much, Dr. Mazzella. We'll see you over on your channel next.
Thank you. All right. Bye, Lisa. Thank you.
Bye bye.